I'm Joshua Knobe, and I'm a professor of philosophy.
And I'm Alison Gopnik, and I'm a professor of psychology.
And today we're going to be talking about recent work in cognitive science on the imagination. So there's actually a controversy within cognitive science about how to think about the imagination. Some researchers have suggested one of the most exciting kind of new aspects of work on this topic is that it's showing how similar people's ordinary way of imagining things is to the kind of approach we see in the systematic sciences, so in actual scientific research. And other researchers have said exactly the opposite, that one of the most exciting kinds of discoveries that's coming out of recent work on our ordinary way of imagining things is how fundamentally different it is from the way that people use the imagination in the sciences. So as it happens, the two of us, Alison and I, are on opposite sides of this controversy. And so we thought we'd just discuss it with each other today. So maybe to begin with, we could talk about some studies that have been done on the imagination within children, and then we can progress to thinking more deeply about what this is really showing us about the human mind. So to begin with, what has the cognitive science been revealing about the way children are able to imagine things?
Well, in the olden days, in the days of Piaget and even the days of Freud, people always notice that children, of course, have magnificent imaginations, that they pretend and that they make up stories, they make up imaginary friends. And the old explanation of that was that it was because children couldn't really tell the difference between reality and fantasy, that they thought that reality and fantasy were basically just the same thing, so that the children would treat an imaginary friend as if it was really like a real person. And what's happened over the last 15 years or so is that we've discovered that that's not true at all. Children are just as good at discriminating the imaginary and the real as adults are. They get very deeply emotionally involved in the imaginary, but then, of course, adults do that too. So sometimes, if you're a grown-up and you're looking at the child, who's terrified by the monster under the bed, you might think, well, he really thinks this is real. That doesn't seem to be true. The children, if you ask them things like, what can you see your imaginary friend? The children will say that they can't. Paul Harris has done some really nice studies that show that children will follow through from imaginary premises, but they're not confused about the difference between reality and imagination.
So maybe you could explain some of Harris's studies and how he managed to get at this issue.
Well, one of the kinds of things that say, Paul Harris has done, and we've done some similar things in our lab, is to give children questions that have what philosophers call a counterfactual quality. That means questions about things that didn't really happen, but that could have happened. So you'll say things like, here's Ducky, and Ducky has been stomping around in the mud outside. And now Ducky's coming into the room with his muddy boots and mud gets all over. And then you could say, well, but suppose Ducky did something different. Suppose Ducky took off his boots before he came into the room. Then would there be mud on the floor or not? So it's asking about something that didn't really happen, but that you could imagine as an alternative course of events. And it turns out that even 2- and 3-year-olds are very good at telling you, here's what could have happened. We did this in my lab with just a series of pictures, like a comic strip. And we said, okay, here's the outcome. Here's the muddy floor. Could you put in a picture that would make it different? And again, even 2- and 3-year-olds are quite good at doing that kind of thing. And that, I think, underpins their imagination and pretense and the kind of wild, vivid imagination that seems so characteristic of them.
So these studies show that even young children are really good at counterfactual thinking. But the key question was whether these kinds of things that children are vividly imagining are still things that they recognize as not being real, that they're able to distinguish reality from fantasy. So how have researchers managed to show that they can make that distinction?
Well, one thing that we can do is just ask questions about what their counterfactual thinking is like. Marjorie Taylor has done beautiful studies looking at children's imaginary friends, which is one of the most vivid examples of children's imagination. And she shows that even though the children have very consistent views about what their imaginary friends are like, the children think and recognize that those imaginary friends are different from reality. Now, the real question becomes, if children do understand the difference between imagination and reality as well as they seem to, why is it that they're spending so much time imagining, pretending? Why are they spending so much time out there in these possible unreal worlds as opposed to the world that they're actually in? And what we've been arguing is that part of the reason for that is because imagining possibilities just comes naturally with kind of theory-like, scientific-like understanding of the world. And the real thing that children are doing is working out the causal structure of the world, making intuitive theories about the world, figuring out how one thing makes another thing happen. And what naturally goes with that is the ability to imagine different possibilities.
So then our ability to think about imaginary friends actually helps us to gain a better understanding of the way the world really works?
Well, it looks like empirically what happens is that there's been a whole bunch of work showing that between the ages of about 3 and 5, children are starting to develop a theory of how other people's minds work, of what they think and feel and believe and how they function. So children are starting to understand how it is that people work, and they're developing this theory. Mm-hmm. Now, again, if you think about what you do when you develop an adult theory, and in fact what characterizes a scientific theory, what makes a theory, is not just the fact that it tells you about the things that actually do happen, but it also tells you about all the things that could happen. So if I have a theory of the planets, for example, it's not just that tells me, okay, if I look up at the sky at this particular time at night, here's what I'm going to see. It also tells me, well, wait a minute, if the positions of Venus and the Earth were switched, here's what I would see when I look up at the sky at a particular time of night. Mm-hmm. Or if suddenly an asteroid appeared, here's the course that it would take. And it's that kind of ability to imagine possibilities that's really crucial to our scientific theorizing and our causal understanding of the world. And that's the thing that lets us imagine, say, well, here's a future possibility. Here's something that we could do that would make the world different than the way the world actually is. So we think we have pretty good evidence that children are developing these everyday theories. And one of the theories that they're developing is a theory of how other people work. And the evidence is that children's imaginary companions, children who have imaginary companions, actually are better at understanding how other people work, and vice versa. Children who are better, working harder at understanding how other people work, are also more likely to be children who have imaginary companions and who are doing a lot of imaginary pretend play. So what that suggests is that developing the theory, actually understanding how something works, and thinking about all the different possibilities about how else it could work, those two things seem to go hand in hand.
Okay, so now we've got these two things. On one hand, we've got the idea that a scientific theory, like, say, a theory in physics, allows you to think about certain kind of counterfactual possibilities. It allows you to think not just about how things really are in the world, but how things would have gone if, say, the initial conditions had been a little bit different. Then, on the other hand, we have the idea that children often engage in certain kinds of pretend play, like pretending that they're a Batman or pretending that they have certain imaginary friends. So what is the connection between them? Is the idea that by pretending that you're a Batman or pretending that have an imaginary friend, you actually come to have a better understanding of certain kind of scientific truths about the world?
Well, I think both things are happening. So I think it's probably closer to being that by doing a kind of scientific investigation of how the world works and understanding it better, you can pretend in more and more vivid and elaborate ways. It's a bit like, think about Einstein doing those thought experiments about the elevator going up, right? It's an interesting question. It seems as if the thought experiments were part of what helped him to develop the theory. But of course, you could also argue that the thought experiments were the consequence of developing this alternative view about how physics worked. So in science, the two things seem to go hand in hand, doing the thought experiment, saying, okay, now what would happen if the speed of light was different from the way the speed of light is, and actually understanding the speed of light. Those two things just seem to be going hand in hand. Now, we also know something about the kinds of experiences that children have in the real world that actually enable them to develop new theories. And one of the interesting things is that as soon as children get new information about how the causal structure of something works, they can make counterfactual inferences about it. So, for example, in our lab, we have developed something that we call the Blicket detector. And the Blicket detector is actually a box that lights up and plays music when you put certain kinds of objects on it. Say you put a red block on next to a black block, and then the detector will light up and play music. And you put the red block on by itself, and the detector doesn't light up and play music. Then you put the black block on it by itself, and it does light up and play music. Now, the question is, what's making that detector work? And the interesting thing is that we've shown that children are very, very good at using quite subtle information about, say, statistical contingencies between causes and effects to figure out what the underlying structure of the detector actually is and how it works. But for purposes of imagination, what's interesting is as soon as they do that, literally as soon as they figure out, okay, the red block makes it work, and the black block, the black block makes it work and the red block doesn't, they can say things like, well, if I had just put the black block on by itself, it would work. If I had just put the red block on all by itself, it wouldn't work. If I took the red block off, then it wouldn't stop. But if I took the black block off, it would stop. So as soon as they get the information that tells them how something works, what the right theory of a Blickett detector or a person is, then just right away they can use that information to consider all of these alternative possibilities. And in fact, it's being able to consider those alternative possibilities that makes science so powerful. It's being able to say, all right, here's a different way that the world could be, and here's something that I could do to make that alternative reality come true.
So maybe you could say a little bit about how the children in your experiments are actually managing to figure out which of the items is the item that turns on the Blickett detector.
Well, we think that what the children are doing is something very similar to using the same sort of processes that scientists do. So how do scientists actually manage to solve scientific problems? Well, there's three things that they seem to do. One thing that they do is that they look at statistical patterns. So, you get a big data set that tells you all about smoking and cancer, and you do a multivariate analysis on that, and that tells you something about the causal relationships. And one of the big things that we've discovered is that even the tiniest babies are already very sensitive to statistical patterns. And we've shown that even 3-year-olds will do things like consider the conditional probability of one event and another event. So one thing they seem to be doing is doing a kind of statistical analysis of what happens around them, when things happen, what other things happen. And then they use that statistical analysis to infer something about the causal structure. But a second thing that they seem to be doing is actually doing experiments. So we've shown in some of the experiments we do, if we just give the children one of these new causal machines and we just say, okay, figure it out, the children will just spontaneously do what we think of as adults as playing. That is, they'll, move the blocks around and see what happens if you turn the blocks upside down and flick the switches on the side of the machine. And just in the course of that spontaneous play, that playing around that we all know that children do so much, we see them actually starting to get the information that they need to solve the problem. So the children are looking at statistics, and they're also looking at experiments. They're also spontaneously doing experiments just in their everyday play. And then the third thing that we know that children do is they look at the information that we provide them as adults. Again, if you're thinking about scientists, they do experiments themselves, they do statistical analyses, and they read the journals, find out what experiments other people are doing. And our children seem to be doing that too. So they're looking at what we do to objects and treating that as if it's a little tutorial about how it is that the objects are actually going to work. And what we've been doing in collaboration with a bunch of computer scientists is to show that the same kind of very sophisticated algorithms that, say, you can use to design a robot that can do science, those very same algorithms seem to be the ones that the children are doing to solve the everyday kinds of problems that children are solving.
And so do you think adults use those very same kinds of techniques, or that adults are different from children in some kind of fundamental way?
Adults probably still have some of the capacities of children, but I think the big difference is that when you're an adult, you're using those capacities for the sake of trying to get things done. So for adults, what you're always trying to do is say, okay, I have this end that I want to accomplish. Here's something that I want to bring about. Here's a plan I have. And now I'm going to do what I need to do to make sure that that happens, make sure that something happens. Whereas I think that for children, the agenda is much more, let me just figure it out. Let's just figure out as much as we can. Let's just get as much information about how the world works as we possibly can. And then just use that information to work out causal structure and sort of assume that later on in life you're going to be able to use that information for good. So my line about this is that children are the R&D department of the human species. So they're the ones who actually just do pure research and development, right? They're the learners. And, and we grown-ups, we're production and marketing. So we take all the things that we learned when we were children, and then we use them to mate and predate and do all the things that we do as adults.
So, and maybe this is precisely what makes it so difficult to have children. They're, instead of just doing the rational thing that would advance their own interest, they're always experimenting with something. What if I try eating this? Or what if I try going into this other room? You have to run after to make sure they don't get into any trouble.
Well, I think that's what's happening both with children's exploratory play when they're, getting into everything, and with their imaginary play where they're just exploring the space of all the possible ways that the world could be. It's not that it's not so much that they can't tell the difference between the imaginary and the real world and the real world. It's just they don't see any particular reason why you'd want to live in the real one when you could live in the imaginary one. Now, for us adults, we don't usually get away with spending too much time living in the imaginary possible worlds. But for children, because they're protected, right? I mean, we're the ones who are protecting them. We're the ones who are taking care of their everyday needs. They don't actually need to do anything. We're the ones who are doing all the things that are taking care of them and keeping them alive. So they can just be devoted to this project of figure out what the world is like as much as possible, and consider all the possible other ways that the world could be.
So now what we've got is children are learning the basic kind of structure of the world by making certain observations, learning from their parents, and actually experimenting in the world, making certain interventions. And then after they've done that, after they've understood this kind of underlying structure, they can use it to imagine other ways that things could have gone. So they can use it to imagine, what would have happened if there were a unicorn, or if I were Cinderella, or if I had superpowers, and so forth. But now a question arises, why do they bother to do that? So if they figured out already by making observations and doing these experiments how the world really works, why is it helpful then to just imagine how it would have worked if, say, they had superpowers, or if they had been on a spaceship or something like that?
Well, it turns out to be computationally complex, even when you've got a theory, working out and generating all of the alternate consequences of that theory actually takes some work. So it's not just that when you have a theory, you automatically know how to draw the right inferences and figure out what the right consequences are. That's actually a skill that you need to develop by itself, and a set of computations that you have to perform to be able to take the theory and work out, here's what the consequences of the theory would be. I mean, again, if you think about science, a lot of what so-called normal science is about is take a theory and then figure out all the consequences of that theory for, say, experiments or for other outcomes.
Oh, so the reason it's helpful to pretend you're G.I. Joe, say, is that by doing that, you're taking a theory that you already have and then kind of trying to work out the consequences of that theory and see how it would apply in this new situation.
So if you're understanding the basics about how people work, part of that is that you can go and think about all the different ways that people could work. So all the other kinds of people that there could be in the world, including, Charlie Ravioli, who's the imaginary friend who's actually so busy that he can't talk to you, or Margarine, who's the school child who has long braids, who explains to you about how the nature of school. So actually understanding what real people are like lets you say, well, here's an alternative. Here's a different way that people could be. Here's a different way that I could be.
So, as you know, I actually have taken the opposite kind of perspective. And what I've tried to argue for recently is that what the experimental results are tending to indicate is that our ordinary capacity to sort of imagine things and think about things is really very, very different from the kind of capacity that we would use in a systematic scientific investigation, something that really differs in a fundamental way from kind of what scientists would do in these cases.
So what would be some of the differences that you think would be there?
Well, I think if you look back, say a few hundred years ago and think about the kind of birth of science, what you see there is something really anomalous, not the kind of thing that kind of existed throughout all of the time that human beings were around, but the birth of a genuinely new way of thinking about things. In particular, I think what you see in the birth of the science, in the scientific revolution, is the interest in a kind of special domain of inquiry where we're going to put aside various kinds of value judgments, judgments about what's right or wrong, what's good or bad, and just engage in a kind of impartial, objective attempt to just figure out how the world works. But I think this special thing that we see now, the existence of this special domain of science, I don't think is really a good clue to the basics of our human nature, to sort of what makes us human. I think what would be a better clue is to look at certain kinds of practices that we see across all cultures and across all times. So if we looked, for example, at religion as an attempt to understand the way the world works, there we see on a way of understanding the way the world works in which statements about what's really happening in the world and underlying value judgments are sort of deeply intertwined. And I think it's there that you see a good model of our ordinary understanding, our sort of folk way of making sense of the universe.
Well, I think there's two things to say about that. So the question is, given that, I mean, here's a really interesting puzzle, right? Developmental psychologists like me, and I'm not the only one, I think a lot of developmental psychologists have found this parallel between what children are doing and what scientists are doing to be very compelling. It seems to give us a very good explanation of what we actually are seeing in children. But, of course, you might think, well, look, this is kind of strange, right? If you look at adults, what you seem to really see is all these differences between scientists and everyday adults. That's what a lot of the literature on probability, for example, shows, that ordinary adults can't do statistical analyses the way that scientists can. And then when you look at babies and young children, it looks as if they actually look more like scientists than everyday adults do. So if we're talking about this kind of basic causal inference, science-forming ability, it's kind of interesting because it must be different from what we're doing in formal science. And in fact, it may be that we actually see more of it in children than we do in typical adults. And I think there may be some good reasons for that. So when you talk about value, for example, right? The significance of values. Again, if you think about this idea that there's a kind of evolutionary division of labor between adults and children, and adults are the ones who are actually trying to make things happen, if what you want to do is actually intervene in the world and make decisions and make things happen, then values are going to be absolutely crucial, right? It's absolutely important to say, all right, is it worth trying to make this happen? Is this outcome actually an outcome that's worth having? Is this something that I should be doing, right? If you are actually using your cognition to go out in the world and act and do things, especially in the context of the social world, then it's really, really important to be able to do that. But if you're a baby or a young child, you're not actually out there acting. Most of what you're doing is just finding things out. And one of my slogans has been, it's not that children are little scientists, it's that scientists are big children. So scientists are a kind of subcategory of adults who get to do the same thing, just freely explore, that children are doing all the time.
So, I think this really offers an exciting empirical way of kind of trying to get at the debate between us. So suppose we looked at some of the effects that we see among adults that seem to show that adults aren't just engaged in this kind of impartial, objective inquiry into how the world works, but their whole way of understanding the world is kind of infused with these value judgments. Then we could try to take those very same studies and see what happens when we do them on younger children, and then we can see whether the same effects continue to arise. Maybe what will happen is exactly what you're suggesting, that the effects we see in adults tend to disappear when we look at children. And then we'd have really good evidence for the hypothesis you've been suggesting, that the children's way of thinking about things is in a deep way really connected with a kind of scientific way of thinking about things.
Well, maybe you could talk a little more about what some of those results actually are, and then we could think about how they would fit with what would be the likely outcomes if you were thinking about children in that context.
Right, that sounds like a good plan. So consider, for example, a recent study that was done about people's causal beliefs. So in this study, all subjects were given a story about someone who had cancer. It was a difficult state with cancer. The cancer was in such an advanced state that if left to its own devices, it would just naturally keep advancing and eventually kill the person. However, the person was hooked up to a machine which would prevent the cancer from taking its normal effect. So because the machine was there, the person was still staying alive. And now a doctor comes over and removes the machine. He unplugs the machine. Then the cancer is no longer being prevented. It just takes its natural course, and then the patient dies. The question the subjects were asked was, did the doctor cause the patient's death, or did the doctor cause the patient's life to end? So the key variable now was that different subjects were placed in different conditions, such that they were given different information that would change their moral views about what the doctor was doing. So there were two different conditions in what was called the morally ambiguous condition. Subjects were told that the doctor really cared about the patient's well-being, and that the doctor was concerned that the patient not be in too much pain. So as a result, the doctor thought, well, the best thing that I can do for this patient, out of mercy for him, is just to unplug the machine and end his pain, bring his life to an end soon. In what was called the morally bad condition, the doctor comes in and is just like, this stupid bum, what is he doing taking up my valuable hospital space? I have to just get rid of this guy so that we can use these valuable resources for patients who are more worthwhile. So he unplugs the machine in hopes of getting the machine back so that he can just use it to help other patients. What you see then is something really interesting. Subjects in the morally ambiguous condition tended to say that the doctor wasn't the cause of the death, that the cause of the death was the cancer. Subjects in the morally bad condition said that the doctor was the cause of the death, and that the cancer actually was less the cause of the death. But of course, what makes the morally ambiguous condition morally ambiguous is the very fact that some people think this kind of behavior is morally bad and some morally good, depending on their views about euthanasia. And in fact, you find that subjects who think that euthanasia in general is something morally bad more said the doctor was the cause, and subjects who generally said that euthanasia is something morally good more said that the cancer was the cause. So what seems to be going on here is that people's ability to figure out which facts within the world are causing which outcomes isn't just an attempt to engage in this kind of scientific investigation of the causal structure of the world. It's an attempt to make a kind of moral sense of the world, to understand which things in the world are, as it were, to blame for the outcomes that arise.
Well, I think there's two things to say about that and about what you might think about the way children would react in certain circumstances. Mm-hmm. So one thing is that kind of problem is the problem that philosophers call actual causation. So it's actually trying to figure out what's the particular single cause of a particular single event. And from a scientific perspective, that's actually not a very good scientific question, right? Scientists aren't usually interested in just qua scientists in what was the cause of this specific event. What they're interested in is how causal laws work, how causal principles work, how one thing causes another thing in general. Mm-hmm. When you ask people what was the cause, or was this the cause or not the cause, then I think it is true that you're going to get a lot of pragmatic value judgments that are going to end up being involved. And that's probably true even for children. But I think what the children are doing is not so much saying, and again, I think this is this difference in perspective. If you're an adult and you need to do things like intervene and change something so that, say, a bad outcome won't happen anymore, then working out what's the cause, what's the thing that I should do about this? You know, what should I do to make sure that this bad outcome doesn't happen anymore? Mm-hmm. That's going to actually be the more important, that's actually going to be what it is that you're trying to do. So it's no wonder that the ethical principles get engaged in that. And I suspect that would be true even for children in a situation in which they had to say, all right, what was the cause? Because we know that children are doing moral reasoning from the time that they're very young, 2 or 3. Mm-hmm. So I think you'd probably find some of those effects with children independently. But the question is, would you find those same effects if instead of saying, what was the cause, you were trying to say, well, could this have been a cause? Was there some general causal connection between the doctor and the outcome in both cases? And then I think you would end up getting a different kind of result.
It is true. I think that would be a great way of resolving this question. So if it really is having an effect on children's basic understanding of causal structure, then maybe you'd predict that in a case in which you use something like your Blickett detector, you could get people's moral judgments to facilitate their ability to really work out the causal structure. That is to say that in a case where something was morally bad, where, for example, the omission of a certain Blickett was morally bad, children would be better able to understand the underlying causal structure, better able to see whether it would turn on the light or not turn on the light. On the other hand, if this kind of moral issues are playing no role at all in the understanding the underlying causal structure, they're just playing a role in which thing we label as cause, then you wouldn't predict that it would have that kind of effect. You'd think children could be able to understand the underlying causal structure just as well either way.
Yeah, I think that's right. And in fact, you might even predict that if the children thought that there was a moral significance to it, that would give them a greater motivation for understanding what the way the causal structure worked. Although it's curious, if you think about adults, it's interesting that when you think about the places where we actually most effectively did science, they're about things like planets and stars and moons, where they have nothing to do with our everyday life. And if you look at things like medicine, where it's got everything to do with important life-saving decisions, actually our causal inference in those areas, at least historically, has not been very good.
Right.
So maybe even for adults, when things get important and emotionally loaded and significant and your life depends on it, that's actually not the time when you do the best cognitive work. That's the time when you just say, all right, I'm just going to go with the strategy as quickly as I can that I think is going to be most effective. And you're not sitting there thinking, how does this actually really work? And what would be the best way of figuring out how it really works?
So, but someone might say that just supports my perspective in the sense that the suggestion is that our ability to do science doesn't really come naturally to us. It's only in these cases in which our natural way of thinking about things is somehow not applicable, like in cases about the planets where there's no way of dealing with it as just a part of our lives, that we're able to engage in this kind of more unnatural attempt to just work out this objective, impartial understanding of the causal structure in the domain.
Well, I think that what's going on is that there's really two different agendas for human beings. And I think this becomes very vivid in the developmental case, but I think it's true in general. I think we always, as people, it's one of the most distinctive cognitive things about us, is that we always have this tension between what economists call explore versus exploit. So we're a species that explores more than any other species. That's our trick. Our trick is that ability to just figure out what's going on around us independently of the particular demands of the moment. That's our great evolutionary accomplishment. But of course, ultimately, we need to put that explorer capacity, that capacity to just figure things out, consider possibilities, to work to actually get things done. And I think in human nature, I think in development in particular and in human nature in general, there's a real intrinsic trade-off between those two things. So if you think about even, neuroscience development, what you see early on is you see this brain that's incredibly plastic, that has millions of connections, that can make lots of new connections, that goes out in the world and explores and finds things out. And it turns into a brain that isn't nearly as good at just learning for its own sake, but is really, really designed to get things done, where all of the connections that are there get implemented very efficiently and very effectively and do the things that they're supposed to do and can make really quick decisions under conditions of lots of uncertainty, for example, which is what we're doing as human beings all the time. And I think it's a basic aspect of human nature that might explain some of the tensions between, say, our scientific intuitions and our religious intuitions, that this impulse that we have to just explore, find out what's there, boldly go to new worlds where no one's gone before. That basic human impulse, I think, is in tension with an impulse which is just as important, which is the impulse to, and which I think we might share more with other species, which is, the evolutionary one of, well, let's do the thing right now that's going to let us succeed the best. But I think it's a kind of interesting paradox. You think it's kind of analogous to what happens within science, right? So if you think about something like funding for science, we all depend on persuading the guys in Washington that what we're doing is actually ultimately going to be useful and end up having important consequences. But it's a bit of a paradox because we all know that the best way of actually getting the science that's going to end up curing cancer and actually having practical moral consequences is by letting the scientists just explore and do things that they want to do themselves without necessarily saying, oh, well, now you're supposed to just do the things that are going to help us cure cancer. So the best way to cure cancer is to have a bunch of scientists and let them just figure out, oh, okay, here's how cells work. And I think, again, developmentally, we may see some of the same thing, that early on we get this period that's kind of like being a scientist. We get this period of protected immaturity where we don't have to do very much, and we're just exploring. And then later, as we get to be adults, we start, and indeed as we get to be, say, school-age children, where our openness, our flexibility gets to be more and more restricted. But that the trade-off is that you get less flexible, but you get to be a better actor and you get to be more effective.
I think this is an incredibly interesting hypothesis, which would be really helpful to test. So is your idea, say, in our original fight about whether a good model for human cognition is something like science or something like religion, that you'd say science is especially a good model for understanding young children. And then as we get older and our thinking becomes more tending toward exploitation as opposed to exploration, we become less interested in R&D and more interested in production. At that point, we become more prone to the kind of thinking that I might think of as more religious.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's at least a hypothesis about what's happening. So as we in fact, I almost think that there might be some phenomena taking place right now where, as we've gone on historically, that period of protected childhood and exploration has gotten to be longer and longer. So, now most of us go to school where we're still just sort of, at least officially, learning for its own sake rather than actually learning how to do anything. And I think that's actually made people smarter, the fact that we have this kind of extended period of just being able to explore. But it may not make us more effective. It may not make us better adults. It may not make us adults who can go out into the world when we're 16 and hunt bear and do all the things that we need to do as adults. So I think even some of our decisions about things like how long a period of schooling we have, how long a period of dependence we have, those things may actually be ending up having an effect on the way that we're going to function as human beings in the future. So I guess I think, part of what I would say, Josh, is I don't think there's such a thing really as a single human nature, because the thing that's most characteristic about human nature is that we can consider all of these different possibilities, and we can actually turn the world and turn ourselves into some of these other possibilities. And ironically, I think what we've been doing in the past 100 years or so with education is, in a way, turning ourselves all into children. Developing formal science was a way to turn ourselves back into a younger version of ourselves. And what the future of human nature looks like when we have lots of much more childlike creatures in the world, like you and me, who are spending our time just exploring things without actually doing anything that's very practical for anybody. Putting more folks like us into the world, what effect that's going to have on human nature is a really good question.
Wait, so as you know, though, this kind of claim that you're making is a very controversial one among developmentalists. So there are some developmentalists like you who have offered this really interesting evidence suggesting that human development is kind of like a scientific inquiry. But then there are other people on the other side who have suggested that human development is really very different from a scientific inquiry, maybe in kind of some of the ways that I've been suggesting. So, for example, Alan Leslie, who has often argued against your kind of view of these things, has suggested that even as very young children, our way of understanding the world really is through and through sort of affected by these kinds of moral considerations. So, for example, in one of his studies with very young children, he tells people a story about a child who wants to bring a frog home just because he really likes frogs. And then, in one condition, subjects are told his friend Janine really loves frogs, and she'll be really happy when he brings the frog home. The question then is, did he bring the frog home on purpose? In the other condition, subjects are told his friend Janine hates frogs, and she'll be really upset if he brings the frog home. But he doesn't care at all about Janine, just as he didn't in the other condition. Then the question again is, did he make Janine upset on purpose? And what we see is that even among really young children, even among children who are 4 years old, the very earliest age where people even able to understand the notion that he doesn't care about Janine, we get this asymmetry that in the morally bad case where he makes Janine upset, subjects say that he made Janine upset on purpose. And in the morally good case where he makes Janine happy, subjects say that he made Janine happy not on purpose. So it seems like even among these very people who are supposed to be the explorers as opposed to the exploiters, we're already seeing this kind of infusion of the world perspective with these moral values.
Well, I wouldn't deny for a minute. I think we have lots and lots of evidence that children much younger than that even babies already have a nascent moral view of the world. And babies don't, even 15-month-olds, for instance, will already behave altruistically towards someone who they see in trouble. And we did experiments that showed that 18-month-olds will take the perspective of another person and try to give the other person what they want, for instance. 2.5-year-olds will say that hitting people is always morally wrong, whereas rule violating isn't always morally wrong. So there's no question that even very young children, in addition to being little scientists, are little philosophers and little moralists, and they're concerned about moral issues, and that they connect things like whether you did something on purpose or not to what your moral position is. So I don't want to say that children are amoral. In fact, I think just the opposite. I think children are very, very deeply involved and concerned in trying to make moral judgments.
Right. Of course children make moral judgments. The key question, what Leslie is arguing, is that children don't have a kind of capacity just to figure out whether you did things on purpose that's independent of their moral judgments. That their capacity to figure out whether you did something on purpose is not a sort of scientific capacity, which they then use later to make moral judgments, but that the moral judgments are actually infusing that capacity itself.
Well, so the question then becomes, in this case, so now we're not talking about just causal judgment, but we're trying to make a judgment about intention, about whether someone did something on purpose. And again, it's a question about in this particular case, if you ask the question, did he do it on purpose or did he not do it on purpose, right? The question is about how relevant is his intention to trying to deal with this particular case. So, sort of pragmatically, how relevant is his intention when you're trying to deal with this case? Now, I don't think you would find that children would say that he was doing it unintentionally in the sense that even in the good case, they wouldn't think that he was just doing it accidentally, that his will wasn't part of it, that he wasn't doing it in order to bring about a goal, that he was doing it the same way that he would when he would bump into it. But if you give them a choice about is this issue about his intention relevant or not, then in the moral case it's going to be a relevant thing to talk about, and it's not going to be as relevant a thing to talk about in the alternative case. I think it's quite clear that children already, from the time they're born, have ideas about the world and ideas about other people and how other people work. And I think it's a really interesting question about how their moral ideas fit into that picture of how it is that other people work. I mean, again, if you think about them as being scientists, little scientists who are trying to figure out how other people work, then the fact that other people work on a moral basis is a really important part of the science, right? So if you're a scientific psychologist, even if you don't care about morality yourself, if you want to understand how people work, you have to take into account the fact that they're moral beings. So it would be, if you think about the children as being little scientists, they'd be really bad little scientists if they didn't have ideas about how things like moral intention interacts with moral culpability interacts with things like making judgments about intentionality.
So tell me if you think this would be a helpful way of getting at the kind of controversy between us. Do you think it would be helpful to look at whether children actually make different predictions in the case where there are different moral significance, or, as you've suggested about actual causation or about the concept of doing on purpose, it's just a matter of them sort of describing the case differently when there are different moral judgments?
Yeah, I think that actually would be a good way of doing it. So would they actually get things wrong, for instance? I mean, for me, that's really the acid test of whether or not you've got a good causal understanding of something, right? So the real acid test for a good causal understanding is, will you perform the effective action, or will you make the right prediction? And if you really make the wrong predictions as a result of your moral, judgment, as opposed to, say, just giving a different kind of explanation, then that might be a sign that your moral judgment was really having an effect on your causal judgment. See, if you're thinking about explanations, one of the things we know about explanations is that the kinds of explanations you give depend a lot on what you think the other person is interested in and what you think is important and what you think is relevant. And all those factors, including moral factors, are going to enter into explanation. It would be interesting to see if children would actually make inaccurate predictions in those cases. But in any case, I mean, I guess my view is, even if it's true that our causal inferences are influenced by our moral judgment, and after all, I think that's true even for adult scientists, that doesn't change the fact that children are making these causal inferences, that they're, one of the most important things that they're doing is actually working out what the causal structure of the world is like, and that they have really, really powerful mechanisms for doing that. And those powerful mechanisms enable them to imagine all these alternative ways that the world could be. Mm-hmm. So I think the real issue isn't so much is morality integrated with the way that we or children do scientific understanding or not. It's how much is the way that we are just, the result of some particular set of constraints that we had back in the Pleistocene, and how much is it the result of the fact that we actually have mechanisms for finding out new things, for considering new possibilities, for getting new ways to be in the world.
So in conclusion, maybe you could just say something that goes beyond exploration toward exploitation, about what kind of significance for our lives it might have if we did learn that children really are like these little scientists. How could we use that in order to make the world a better place?
I'm sorry, Josh, could you just give me
So in conclusion, maybe we can turn from pure exploration to exploitation and ask, so you've provided this kind of deep theory about the nature of development, that human development is kind of like a process of developing scientific understanding. So now what can we then use that to do in terms of developing a better world or understanding better how human beings are and sort of improving our lives?
Right. Well, I think one thing that's really important is that in terms of what we do with children, a sort of obvious but relevant thing is that this spontaneous play, for example, both their spontaneous pretend play and their spontaneous exploratory play, is actually helping them figure out the basic structure of the world. Mm-hmm. And that's relevant because lots of educational interventions, like a lot of the No Child Left Behind ideas in preschools, are doing just the opposite. So they're saying, let's, get rid of the pretend play corner because that's not where kids are really learning, and let's give them reading drills because that's where they're really learning. So there's one practical consequence, which is that the children's play really is a way of figuring things out in the world. But I think there's a deeper consequence, which is that I think a view of cognitive science that's around a lot that people like Alan Leslie or Steve Pinker or Noam Chomsky have is that we're sort of stuck in these bounds of the way that we were when we were hunter-gatherers. That the most fundamental facts about us are these constraints on the way that we can be based on the way that we were. And I think the most fundamental fact about us is that we evolved to have capacities for learning new things and for considering new possibilities based on what we learn, including considering new possibilities about how we could function as people. And that's really the great thing about our human nature. So I think that's actually a very optimistic view. So it's a view that says, yeah, we evolved. We're creatures that are the result of a particular history. We are creatures with particular kinds of brains. All of that's true. But in fact, the fact that we evolved and are creatures with those kinds of brains is the thing that gives us this capacity to end up in places that we never would have started. And I think you see that most dramatically with children. You see children learning brand new things that they could never have imagined. And you see them using that learning to imagine new ways the world could be that are totally different from the way that anybody else in the entire history of humankind has thought about how people can be. And I think in the moral realm as well, in cognitive science, there's been this tendency to act as if moral psychology is about, okay, well, we have this moral grammar that we're born with, that we're stuck with, that determines our moral decisions. And I think when we actually look at development, we look at how much flexibility and power and there is both for learning new things and imagining new things, that extends to the very idea of the kind of moral judgments we make themselves. So our very ideas about what kinds of things we should do and what kinds of moral judgments we can make aren't just fixed and constrained, but they're not up for grabs either. The same kinds of principles that let us say we can imagine, an Einsteinian universe, something totally different from anything we would have imagined, but we actually can agree, yeah, there's good evidence for that Einsteinian universe. That same kind of reasoning can make us say, here's a new moral principle. Gay people should be allowed to get married, something that has never happened in the course of history before. And we can actually say, oh, okay, well, here's the moral values, here's the moral principles, here's the moral arguments that you could use to make a judgment about that.
So on that note, thank you so much. It's been great talking with you.
Great to talk to you, Josh, as well. And we're both old philosophers, come psychologists who become or have become psychologists.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Josh.
Bye-bye.